Okay, now that we've had a little bit of a break, I want to start in on what would be chapter 2 in the book. Chapter 2 is called Indigenous Religions of North America. Okay, Indigenous Religions of North America. We're going to study the religions of the indigenous peoples of the 48 contiguous states. We're not talking about Alaska, and we're not talking about Hawaii. We're going to be talking about the 48 contiguous states, although we will look a little bit into some of the religions of the Central Americans, the Mayans and the Incas especially. The religions of North America are anything but simple. Okay? In truth, the religions of indigenous North Americans is very complex. They have different views of the world, and they have different views of ethics, strong ethics. It is thought that you could lump all the peoples of the indigenous peoples and you could just lump them together with their same faiths and everything like that. If you think that idea, if you have that idea, you would be wrong. There were at one time over 700 tribal nations recognized in North America. Let me say that again. At one time, there were over 700 tribal nations recognized in North America. There were probably many more than that, but some of them were never really recognized by the American government or by the U.S. government. Prior to colonization, there were over 100 million indigenous natives in this land. But because of disease and because of conquests, the number dropped dramatically. There is a huge diversity, or a great diversity, of indigenous North American religious traditions. And because of these diversities, there are different tribes, different ideas, different feelings. But as we look at all of these different things, we will be able to grasp, if you will, some common beliefs among the people themselves. Practices, teachings, and the historical development of many of the religions are shared. Let's talk about the teachings. First of all, the teachings of indigenous native religions. Now, there needs to be a look at, if you will, first of all, some common beliefs among these religions. Particular beliefs: creation. How was everything created? Human origins. What is the interrelationship of humanity? And then how does humanity, if you will, cooperate or be a part of the world in which they live? And then there's also sacred language and sacred space. There are no specific creeds. There are no specific statements of what is believed. Essential teachings are brought from one generation to the next generation, possibly through mythical narratives, word, stories passed down from one generation to the next. These are then lived out, if you will, through religious practices. Most of the narratives are mystical or mythical in nature, but they are very rich in their sacred knowledge. This sacred knowledge for indigenous Americans is really committed to the heart. And then what happens then is, once it's committed to the heart, it is passed on by mouth to the next generation. Basically saying, let me tell you what we believe. Let's talk about creation and origins of the world. Creation stories are found in almost all the different tribal nations. Some speak specifically of the creation of the whole earth and human origins. Some speak just to the particular group that they belong to. Some speak of human beings coming to the surface of the earth from underground. Some speak of the formation of humans by some kind of creator gods. But despite their differences, despite the differences in creation stories, most native mythological mythologies and the origins of people consider North America to be their ancestral home. Basically, most indigenous North American religious people believe they were created in North America. Let's talk about creation and sacred power. In native religions, there are many creation stories attributed to a creator or super beings who were creators. The Great Plains tribes speak of a supreme being, which is better known as the Great Spirit. Some tribes believe the elements of the Great Spirit inhabit all objects, including those that are inanimate, not just human beings. Other tribes believe that the Great Spirit lives aloof above creation and it allows lesser spirits and lesser deities to interact with creation. Many native religions believe in some supreme force. They believe in some sacred power, if not a specific being. Navajos believe in the holy wind, and it is the holy wind that inhabits all elements and actions and thoughts. The Aztecs recognize different deities who possess different types of sacred powers. Some of these deities, according to the Aztecs, were tapped for creation and some for fertility, while others were related to the sun. I'm going to spell this name. Quetzalcoatl was a serpent covered with feathers who was thought to be associated with the power of creation. And some myths say he even helped the creation by providing food and nourishment to people. He was, according to the Aztecs, he was the serpent who was powerful and could create all things. For a second, let's talk about human origins and human ancestors. Some myths speak of the creation of humans, while others speak of the existence of certain localities. In other words, some myths speak of the creation of people, while other myths speak to these people existed in this particular place. But either direction, it is believed, according to the indigenous beliefs of North America, it is believed that all human beings originated in the Americas. This belief contradicts the idea that Native Americans migrated from Asia. There was the belief, again, that they migrated from Asia, that at one time Alaska was connected to Russia, and the people just walked across the straits there and came right on into North America and took their place in the North American continent. The Mayans of Central America have their own creation narratives, but unlike the others, these have been passed down. Those that were passed down orally, unlike them, the Mayans have written them down. They have their own written language, and they contain all of these mythical narratives. The Quiche, Quiche, Mayans have Popol Vuh, Popolvhu. This is their writings that contain the stories of creation. And the Popol Vuh speaks of a creator God. And the first thing God did was he created animals. But the animals couldn't talk, so therefore God had no one to talk to. So then God created wooden mannequins, and they could talk, but they had no heart, so they couldn't love. And then the creator God took cornmeal with water, mixed it together, and he created humans, and that attempt was successful. Other native myths don't describe creation, but they describe people, and this is very interesting. It describes people emerging from the surface of the earth. The Zuni tribe in southwest U.S., they have a god called, and I'm going to spell this, Awonawilona. And this God created the earth with his breath and with his body. ancestors of the Zuni tribe. They say, the Zuni tribe says that their ancestors lived underground, under the earth. And eventually, two warrior gods were created, and they led the Zunis out from under the earth and up to the surface. And according to them, every couple of years, every few years, the earth reopens and another group of people emerge to live. Navajos described their ancestors as holy people. They lived under the earth, but everything under the earth was total chaos. And it was so stress-filled that no one got along. People mistreated each other. And so finally, the Navajos worked their way to the surface where the first man and the first woman were born. And then they were given the responsibility to create the world and the people in it. Rituals were used to establish order. An interesting ritual that was practiced was to paint on the ground. Paint on the ground, and through prayer and music, the picture would come to life, and then the world would be created. Basically, the world was painted on the ground, and music was played, and prayers were said, and all of a sudden everything came into being. Finally, an important figure for the Navajo was the changing woman. The changing woman. She gave birth to twins. And these twins helped her to vanquish the monsters that roamed the earth and made it possible for people to inhabit it. It was the changing woman who created the Navajos from her own body. That's what they believe, that she created the Navajo tribe and the Navajo nation out of her body. Pueblos. The Pueblos believed in ancestral spirits called the Kachinas, Kachinas. And the Kachinas could take on many forms. But these spirits, these Kachinas, were perfect while people were imperfect. In the afterlife, the Hopis, who are part of the Pueblo nation, show human imperfections through their ritual dances and their ceremonies. Basically, the Hopis would use clowns in their dance ceremonies. This is because people believed, or at least the Hopis believed, that it was clowns who led the people under the earth out to the surface of the earth. And in their dances, they put on masks. When they put on the mask, they believed the Kachinas would inhabit them at that moment and would inspire them to do something. Yeah, we see them as myths, but there are some life lessons to be learned in these myths. How to live properly in the world. How do I live properly in the world comes out of these myths. How do we be respectful of others in our society? How do I make a living, especially off the earth? And then also in these teachings, there was someone called the trickster, Trickster. The trickster often would take on forms of animals, and the trickster was always full of mischief. He would always try to get people to do something wrong. He was always being punished for giving people the wrong ideas and causing them to behave improperly. Now, these myths also brought on life lessons that we can learn, and they did learn from dramatically. Everyday actions such as planting crops and maybe the preparation of food, or all these things took on a sacred perspective. One such idea is the origin of corn. The Cherokees believe in the myth of the goddess Corn Woman. And she would simply rub her body, and wherever she rubbed her body, then corn would be produced in that particular place. Her children, her sons, saw her one day, and they thought she was practicing witchcraft, so they attacked her, and they tried to kill her. And she told them to drag her body along the ground to where her blood dripped, and when her blood dripped, the corn would grow. The lesson from this is that which causes death can also bring life. Isn't that neat? That which causes death can also bring life. There's also the ideal of the importance of imbalance. Humanity and the natural world. How do these things stay in balance? Humans and all the things in the world, according to most Native American religions, share a common spiritual energy, and they also share the sacred. In some of the teachings, humans were created as companions to all the creatures and not as masters. Listen again. In some of the teachings, humans were created as companions to all creatures and not as masters. Many of the teachings of the Native American religions, they believe that humans descended from animals, or at least animal-like creatures. And almost all Native teachings believed in maintaining the balance of all things. Let's talk about sacred places and also sacred spaces. It is believed that humans and the land are so interdependent upon one another. People and the land are extremely interdependent upon one another. Myths that show the land as sacred give rise that builds to communities, and architecture also had certain sacred dimensions, if you will. The Navajo Nation had a sacred place called the Hogan, Hogan, which comes through their stories passed down from one generation to the next. The teepee, which we have heard so much about, the teepee is designed by a sacred blueprint. The parameter of the teepee represents the edge of the universe. And then there's the fire in the middle of the teepee representing the center of existence, and the smoke escaping through from the fire and escaping through the opening at the top is a message to the spirit world. Architecture took on a religious meaning. Let's talk about sacred language and sacred time. In many Native culture, time is seen more as cyclical or circular rather than linear. In other words, it's a lot like the religions of Hinduism and Buddhism and several of the others that believe in reincarnation. The past will happen again, according to many of the indigenous American religions. Even death is welcomed in many cases, and rituals were used in many of the religious practices to help the deceased move from this life to the next life. Many cyclical views in time. It's kind of like cyclical views of a person's life is equated with the seasons. Winter, spring, summer, fall, winter. There was a song out back in the 1960s by a fella by the name of Bobby Goldsboro. And the song was called In the Autumn of My Life. And it kind of goes along with this. In the autumn of my life, I was doing this. In the spring of my life, I was doing this. In the winter of my life, it was just a beautiful song that talks to this very particular thing. In some Native cultures, they have what are called cry ceremonies, CRY ceremonies. These are times of sacred mourning. We would almost might equate it to a funeral with mournful songs and mournful dance. Several people would tell stories of the deceased. And if this doesn't sound like a funeral, I don't know what does. Navajos have chants, and they chant a lot of these things rather than having just simple cry ceremonies. There are lots of songs, there are lots of chants, and they use language to bring everything into the present. So, for just a second, let's talk about the history of indigenous American religions. Conquest and colonization and Christianity all took a major part in the history of the indigenous American religions. With the expansion of imperialism during the 16th century, going all the way through the 20th century, indigenous Native Americans were radically changed. And so were their religions. Populations were devastated by disease, devastated by warfare, And many were forced to leave their homelands, and they were forced to be enslaved, so to speak. During this time, also, many missionaries were sent to bring the Christian faith to the native people. Many were converted, if you will, not by forcibly and not by choice. In the 19th and 20th centuries, many native children were taken from their homes. They were sent to boarding schools. They were indoctrinated, if you will, into a whole new culture. In 1819, the Civilization Fund Act. This was used to build more schools. This was used to civilize these children. Now, indigenous religion was more forcefully eradicated, and many were converted to Christianity. In truth, the native Christians see Christianity, and this is true, Native Americans see Christianity as more of an indigenous Native American religion than Christianity itself. Along the way, there have been some resistance movements. One was the ghost dance, Ghost dance. The religious leader said a religious leader said he saw a vision, and the native people were performing this particular special dance, and the white people, if they performed this dance, the white people would leave their land. Wokova, Wovoka, was a Paiute, a Native American indigenous person. He was a man who studied religion, and he was also at the very first ghost dance, Wokova, and he kept the ghost dance going over and over and over again, year after year after year, until the federal government saw it more of as an uprising. On December the 29th, 1890, many Lakota people involved in the dance were massacred at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. The Native American church was a resistance movement. This dance, this ghost dance, was seen as a movement, and they really, really pushed the government. Now, the peyotes really pushed the government as well in some of their religious rituals. In the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, basically, the government gave them the right to smoke peyote as part of their religious activity. Dakota access pipelines are still going on, and it is still seen as a resistance. Indigenous North American religions are also seen as a way of life. Healing. Sometimes healers used religious knowledge to bring healing. They may have good knowledge of local plants, and they also had medicinal properties. Some healers would go through years of training, if you will, and in many traditions, the healers were also religious leaders. Let's talk about women and gender in indigenous North American religions. The role of gender varies from one culture to another. Some myths held that a woman was held in a prominent position, as many of the healers in these religions were also, if you will, actually women. They speak of two spirits, neither male nor female, just not biologically, maybe male, but they adopt, if you will, some of the female behaviors. Normally, let's talk about the rites of passage in most of these. Normally, the mark is a transition from childhood to adulthood. There's a word called Kinaalda, which is a girl's rite to passage. The Navajos, it took place when a girl started menstruating, and an older woman began to teach the girl what was expected of her, what was her role. In some of the religions, there was the baking of a giant corn cake for girls. And if you bake this giant corn cake and it turned out well, then your life would be fine. But if your corn cake turned out poorly, your life would be poor as well. There's also the vision quest. That vision quest represents another transition into adulthood, where one finds one's spirit guide who helps them in life. There are some rites of renewal, and there are also some rites of purification. There must be a balance in between nature and humans. Rites of renewal, such as the jump dance. The jump dance was given to immortals to renew the harmony of nature. And there was also the sweat lodge, which is a purification of the body. If you've seen any of the Walker Texas Ranger, there were times when he went into the sweat lodge to purify himself. Now, that ends the introduction, and that also ends the Native American religions. So I will be sending these videos by way of your emails. Watch them. I will also be sending you papers to help you understand these things. And I will see you next week, probably the same place here, but we'll talk about that then. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye.